Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining us. And if you're joining us again, thank you for this live talk to celebrate World Space Week with STEM Ambassador Katherine, who is a former Chief Executive of the UK Space Agency, Chair of the Global Network on Sustainability in Space, and founder of primaryspace.org. She is a very busy lady, but it's great to see so many people back with us again today, and we're sure you will enjoy this webinar. So you're in for a space treat, as Katherine will tell you why she cares so much about space, why we should all care about protecting the space environment, and about some of the people and companies who are doing exciting work to clean up and keep space safe for our future. Please feel free to ask any questions by putting them into the chat, and Katherine will aim to answer as many as she can at the end of her talk. So that's enough from me. We finally have Katherine, so I'm going to hand you over. Good afternoon, Katherine.
Oh, good afternoon, and thanks, Lisa. And happy World Space Week to everybody. This year, World Space Week is celebrating entrepreneurship. So I thought I would just start with a couple of words about what is an entrepreneur. Here are a few famous entrepreneurs. You might recognize some of their names. An entrepreneur is a person who comes up with an original idea for a new business and then sets that business up. Even though sometimes, those businesses might be quite difficult or risky or unusual, and other people might not believe that it's a good idea or that it can be a success. I don't think that any of these people, when they were the ages that they are shown in the pictures here, would necessarily have predicted that they would grow up to be such hugely successful entrepreneurs, but they have done. A few of these actually have done some work in the space sector, in the space industry as well. There are actually lots of entrepreneurs working in space businesses, so my talk today is really going to focus a lot on that as well. If you think about it, pretty much every space business is a pretty new business, because there are lots of businesses like banks and book publishers that have been around for hundreds of years, but space businesses have really only been around since the 1950s. Here's a picture of the first book that was ever printed, for mass printing. And here's a picture of the first successful satellite ever to orbit the Earth. That orbited the Earth in 1957, and it was called Sputnik. We'll come back to Sputnik later. New space businesses, they started being developed really because the American government and the Russian government decided to get into a big competition around who could put the first object into space. The Russians won that race with Sputnik, and who could put the first human on the moon, and the Americans won that one. Now, if you think about businesses that are space related, I expect you probably think about these things: rockets. And certainly you need rockets if you're going to put things in space. These are some pictures of rocket companies that are based here in the UK. Now, these were actually started by entrepreneurs: Skyrora, Orbix, Small Spark, and Gravity Lab. What I like about these new entrepreneurial rocket companies is that what they're trying to do is to make rockets that are more environmentally friendly than the old-fashioned rockets that we used to use. Now, we also, if you're going to launch rockets, need to have spaceports. And there are lots of new spaceport businesses opening up in the UK as well. Here's a map of the UK, and it shows that we've got 7 spaceports already trying to start new spaceport businesses for launching rockets. Rockets launch in 2 different ways. Some go straight up, vertical launch, and those 3 spaceports that are showing blue on here, they are vertical launch spaceports. And then there are 4 entrepreneurial companies in the UK doing horizontal launch, which is kind of a new approach, where you take a very large plane up to the outer edges of the Earth's atmosphere, and then you launch your rocket from there. And this year, just in January, the very first launch took place from Spaceport Cornwall. Unfortunately, that wasn't a successful launch, but there will no doubt be a successful launch from one of these spaceports very, very soon. Another type of business that's been around since the 1950s is our businesses to support astronauts. And we don't have a lot of those in the UK because we haven't had a lot of British astronauts. The first British-born astronaut, Helen Sharman, did go into space quite some time ago, and I think it was in the 1980s from recollection. And Tim Peake, he was on the International Space Station when I was at the space agency, so I've had the pleasure of getting to know him a bit. And we have 3 new British-born astronauts who are preparing and training to go into space. Megan Christian, John McFall, and Rosemary Coogan. So maybe now that we're getting more astronauts, we might see more entrepreneurs turning their eye to how to start businesses that support astronauts. Just as an aside, John McFall is a really interesting astronaut because he's the world's first ever para-astronaut who's now working with the European Space Agency to discover how disabled people will be able to live and work in space. So that makes him a bit of an entrepreneur too, trying something new and different. The rover that you see in this picture, we have quite a few companies involved in building robotic rovers and building science instruments to go on science missions into space. This is called the Rosalind Franklin, and that was built right here in the UK by a company called Airbus. There's a brother rover to this one that they're hoping to send to the moon someday. Rosalind Franklin will be going to Mars in 2026. Now, what we do have a lot of in the UK are satellite companies, lots and lots of satellite companies. We're one of the world leading countries for making satellites, but our satellite businesses are quite entrepreneurial. So we've invented the idea of small satellites, and we've invented in this country lots of interesting new satellite businesses. Space is a very harsh, challenging environment. So when you're inventing something that you can use successfully in space, often that means that you have to come up and discover new things that would also work very well down here on the ground. And so here are a couple of businesses that have been started using technologies that were developed for space travel. You probably didn't know that the memory foam in your trainers was actually first designed to keep astronauts' bottoms and backs comfortable when they were launching on the Apollo missions all those years ago. The other thing that we use every day down here are satellites. Now, you may, again, not realize that we all use satellites all day, every day in our everyday lives. If we had no satellites, it would be much, much harder to forecast the weather. Mobile phones wouldn't work properly. The emergency services would take much longer to find the emergency. Cash machines wouldn't work properly. There'd be no sat-nav, no satellite television, no Uber, no Deliveroo. And actually in some parts of the world, and even in some parts of this country, there would be no internet access. So all of those things depend on satellites to work properly. We also use satellites, really importantly, to study climate change and understand the Earth's health. Here's a picture that I like to use. I mean, I don't like it because it's not a nice picture, but it's a sad picture that we can only see from space. This is a picture of Lake Urmia in Iran. And you can see how not that long ago, in the 1980s, it was a very healthy, very large, full lake, full of wildlife, very healthy. And then probably, around the time some of you might have been born, you can see it was already suffering. And now the latest pictures from NASA, which were just a couple of months ago this year, are showing that that lake is almost completely gone. So scientists really find it useful to have satellites in order to help monitor the health of our planet. Another thing satellites do is they save lives. Just in March this year, 4 people were left for 10 hours in the Pacific Ocean after their sailboat was sunk because it ran into a whale, or the whale ran into the sailboat. This isn't a picture of that boat because that boat is in the Pacific Ocean and we couldn't find a picture of that. But the good news is that those people were rescued. They were rescued because they could send text messages and signals through satellites to people who were able to raise the alarm and send out rescuers. And there's a group that has been rescuing people since 1982 using satellites to help when ships get into trouble, or for instance, if a mountain climber gets into trouble, they can track where the location was that they started to get into trouble, and they could send rescuers out. And since 1982, they've already been involved in using satellites to support more than 50,000 rescues. So all of those types of businesses and products and services, they've been around for quite a long time. But now I'm going to talk to you about some even more entrepreneurial things where they haven't been around, they're not even happening yet, but they will be happening in the next few years. And I'm going to introduce you to a couple of entrepreneurs that I know. This is Josh Western. I used to work with Josh Western at the UK Space Agency, and then he left in order to start a business that is creating spacecraft, a business called Space Forge. And what they're going to do is they're going to launch small spacecraft, small machines into space that can make things like microchips or ingredients that go into medicines. They'll make them in space because space is a vacuum and it has extreme temperatures, extremes of cold and extremes of heat, and there's almost no gravity. So things like crystals and metals can be made much stronger and much purer than is possible on Earth. So those things are going to be made in space, and then Space Forge is going to bring them back down so that they can be used on Earth to make things stronger and better down here. Another entrepreneur is Bianca Cefalo. She started a company called Space Dots. I like the name of her company, and it makes very small devices about the size of a mobile phone. And those devices can go up on any satellite, and they can test materials or run tests on parts of things in space and send all the information digitally back down to Earth about what the tests have found. So this is like taking very large equipment that's maybe on the International Space Station today and squeezing it into a tiny, tiny package so that they can test things much faster and cheaper than they can do on the International Space Station. This entrepreneur is called Sam Adlin. His new company is called Space Solar. And they're working on a way to collect energy directly from the sun up in space and beam that energy back down to Earth. So it's like lots of solar panels, but really pointing directly at the sun without the clouds and the Earth's atmosphere getting in the way. It is possible that that sort of technology, it could provide all the power that we ever need down here on Earth forever. But it's a very challenging and new and interesting thing to try and do. And it will be several years before they're able to even start trying that out. And this lady is called Elena Levsnevsky. She's one of the entrepreneurs who started a company called Space Entertainment Enterprises. They're planning to launch a film studio into space and make movies and TV programs up there, and maybe even beam live space sports events down to your TV set. Can you imagine what kind of sports you might be able to play without any gravity? All of these entrepreneurs are building these new businesses right now in the UK, even though you've not maybe heard of them because they haven't actually started offering their services yet. They're really early businesses just starting out. And there are entrepreneurs all over the UK and around the world who are doing other really interesting things, like they intend to go and mine asteroids for valuable metals and minerals, or do construction in space using robotic spacecraft to build things in space without having to build them down here on the Earth, take them apart, take them up to space, and put them back together. Or space tourism is another business that quite a few entrepreneurs are getting involved in. They're looking at launching space flight tours. They're looking at launching space hotels. And there are also entrepreneurs are looking at building inflatable habitats, inflatable pods that you could use maybe as a space hotel, or you could use it as a lab or a place to live and work on the moon, and maybe someday on Mars. So all of these exciting new businesses mean that your future is going to be very different to, how I grew up. There's going to be so much more going on in space. But it does also bring some problems with it. So I'm going to show you a graph just because you might have been working with graphs in school. You don't have to read all of this. There's a lot of detail on here, but I'm just going to explain that the bottom axis is the year of launch, the year an object was launched, and the side shows the number of objects that were launched in that year. And you can see it starts right down in 1957 with one thing, that was put into space, so that was Sputnik. And then all the way over on the other side, you see these very high yellow bars in 2022 showing that, about more than 2,400 objects were launched in 2022. The other thing that it's showing us is that the yellow color there, or whether it looks yellow or gold, or is that sort of color to you, is showing how many of those objects are actually businesses launching things. They're commercial things instead of, for instance, space agencies. And that's just showing you in one quick picture, first of all, that the number of things going up into space is growing very quickly, more and more every year. And that most of those things are actually now being put into space for new and interesting businesses. And a lot of that is being launched by entrepreneurs like Elon Musk. You saw his picture in the earlier photos of famous entrepreneurs. I mean, if you take him as an example, he just launched SpaceX. He started that company a few years ago. But he has launched so many satellites now, SpaceX have, into space, that more than half of the satellites that are up there in space now belong to SpaceX. So that sort of growth of the population in space, the number of objects in space, is starting to cause some problems. The history of those problems started probably with Sputnik, although Sputnik is now long gone. And so many objects have been launched since then. But the way they're designed is that those satellites, for instance, they're launched, but they're kind of launched and then they work for a period of time and then they stop working. And then they wait for them to deorbit and come back to Earth. Now, the problem with that is that there are really probably a huge number of objects up there that are not controllable, that have stopped working, but they haven't deorbited yet. So that it's just like leaving your car on the highway when it breaks down. And the problem is that space junk travels around at 17,500 miles per hour. I mean, the other thing that you see up there, aside from satellites that have stopped working, is rocket bodies. Bodies of rockets that, in the old days, before those companies that I showed you earlier have figured out how to launch rockets in a more environmentally friendly way, rockets were designed to just go up and be left behind when the mission was over. And those are huge things. They're huge, and something the size at least of a London bus, or 2 or 3 of those, and they start to fall apart over time. It's kind of like taking a huge jumbo jet up, using it once, leaving it in the air, and it just flies around forever with nobody able to steer it. That's what, space junk is like. And it does cause damage. It can hit things and cause damage. Almost every satellite that is working up there has to move out of the way of different pieces of space junk at least a couple of times every year. And increasingly frequently, the astronauts working on the International Space Station, they also have to take shelter in order to be safe in case a big piece of space junk is approaching. Luckily, there are entrepreneurs who are working on solutions to space junk. I think I missed a page. Here we go. So here are 3 examples of companies, very entrepreneurial companies here in the UK, who are working on solutions to clear up junk. That's ClearSpace and SSTL and Astroscale, but there are others. And they're trying to find ways to go up and grapple those dead satellites and the big pieces of junk and to safely bring them back through the Earth's atmosphere so they can burn up there. And it's not just those kind of companies who are looking at new technologies. There are all sorts of interesting jobs that people are doing to help keep space safe. You've got astronomers and physicists and data scientists and software programmers. They're working on how to keep track of objects in space and how to help the people who are operating space objects avoid collisions. And lawyers and government officials, they're working to try and get people to agree to stop cluttering up space and how to collaborate together, how to work together to clean up the space environment. Engineers are designing better, safer rockets and better, safer spacecraft that will leave less junk behind. Oh, by the way, the lawyer and the physicist on this picture are people I know, and they both started their own businesses focusing on these questions of how to look after the space environment. So I'm very grateful to entrepreneurs like that. I'll just leave you with this one thought. Here's a picture of me when I was in primary school. And while I have not turned out to be a famous entrepreneur, I have built up a new organization, that global network on sustainability in space, and now has more than 650 members around the world that are all working to try and keep space safe and sustainable. And I would tell you that the young me in that picture would have never, ever imagined that that is the work that I would be doing when I grew up. But I have to say, I really love my job. So thank you very much for listening. And now I'll try and answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Katherine. That was such an interesting talk. So thank you very much. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Sophie, that will put some of the questions to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Katherine. I can see we've got some questions coming through, so please pop them in that chat there. Okay, so our first question is, would you like to go into space?
I always get that question whenever I give a talk, and unfortunately the answer is no. It's not for me because I get really badly motion sick if I even just go on a roller coaster. And until they figure out a technology, you know, where you can just like snap your fingers or something and then you're in space, the journey to space and back, I think would just be a bit too much for my stomach. But I really would love to be able to see the Earth from space. All the pictures I've seen and all the people I have met who have had that opportunity, they just say how beautiful the Earth is. And I would love to be able to see that. But it's unfortunately not for me, space travel.
Okay, probably the same for me as well, I would think. Right, which I'm sure some of our students watching would love to go into space.
If you like a roller coaster ride, it'd be a good thing to check out for future.
Definitely. Okay, so our next question is, can space junk be reused?
It's a really good question, and actually there are some entrepreneurs who are working on the idea of reusing and recycling the space junk up in space, so that you don't have to bring it back down and burn it up in the Earth's atmosphere, but you can actually take it apart and use it to build new things. So I don't know if it's possible, but I do know that there are scientists and entrepreneurs who are doing lots of interesting work on that question.
Okay, we've got lots of questions coming through now. How big is a black hole?
Haha. Well, I wish I could answer that question because I'm not a physicist or a scientist. So I have to turn the question back and say, where do you think you could find that information?
Okay.
I would try the internet.
Definitely. I think Google is your friend there. Okay, our next question comes from West Park School. What happens when two galaxies collide?
Oh my goodness, everybody has all the questions for the astrophysicists. Again, I'm really sorry because I'm not an astrophysicist. I can't answer that question. I don't know what happens when two galaxies collide. It does sound like a really interesting question, so I'm definitely going to Google that when I finish this talk.
Okay, so I've got another question here. What's your favourite thing about working with space?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I have to say, I think my favorite thing is that there's still so much we don't know. There's still so much to discover about space. And that's true of lots of things down here on Earth as well. But space still holds a lot of mysteries. And I think because of that, I just really enjoy being involved in a little way, even though I'm not a scientist or an engineer, because almost every day in what I do, I learn something new.
Okay. Got so many coming through. Let's look. With a primary school, we're asking, what is your favourite planet?
Earth.
Earth. Very good. Okay. And Michael, Cedar Primary, do you know any facts about Planet 9?
Ooh, well, I don't, although I have twins and they're in year 5, and I expect they do know more about Planet 9 than I do. I don't, but I will just go back to the previous question and say why I think Earth is my favorite planet. And it's not just because it's the one I know the best. It's because we are really quite unique. And even though we are more and more with the stronger and stronger telescopes, like the latest one, the James Webb Telescope, we are finding more and more planets that are in what's called the Goldilocks zone, which means close enough to their star, their sun, to be able to have liquid water. So not too hot and not too cold, just kind of in the right position near their star that they could have liquid water. And therefore, they could support life the same way that Earth does. But so far as we have been able to discover, we haven't discovered any other planet that actually has life the way that Earth has. And that's why I think we're so special.
Okay. Right. So our next question is all the junk satellites? That's St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I should say that if you hear somebody talking and using the word space debris, debris includes junk, but also natural things like, bits of meteorites and things like that. So there's kind of rocks up there, there's dust, there's electromagnetic particles that have been spit out by the sun, and then there's junk. And it's not just from satellites. Interestingly, there's a whole bunch of stuff that humans have put up there. I talked about the rockets and how they have been left up there traditionally, and then they start to fall apart and disintegrate and lots of little fragments. But there's also a whole bunch of stuff that humans have lost when they were doing spacewalks on the space agency, on the International Space Station. So I believe there's a camera somewhere up there, there's a glove. And then there was a very weird experiment that the American military did where they launched a whole bunch of little copper needles with the idea that actually, and this was a long time ago, I can't remember when, about in the early 1960s, was to make a huge radio antenna around the Earth that would transmit radio waves. What they didn't realize was because the sun is always throwing out those magnetic particles, those copper needles became magnetized. And what happens when metal becomes magnetized? They all started to stick together. And so now you have these kind of cricket ball sized clumps of metal. There's still, I believe, about 44 of them left up there. They haven't all deorbited. So yeah, there's quite a lot of strange things up in space. So not all of the junk comes from satellites, but all of the junk that I would call junk comes from human beings putting things into space.
Okay, right. Valewood Primary School would like to know, what do you have to do to become qualified for your job?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think what qualified me for my job was my education. And to be honest, because I'm not an engineer and I'm not a scientist, the work that I do involves being able to think and write and explain things to people, and being able to plan and work in a team, and also problem solve, find good solutions to problems. But the people that I know and I work with who are scientists and are engineers and are lawyers and people who have those kind of professional qualifications, they just, they needed to have a lot of curiosity and really like to get to the bottom of answering questions about why and how and what and how to make things work and how to find solutions. And then they did have a really good education as well. So they stuck to their studies and they worked hard at school.
Okay. Wow, we've got so many questions coming through. This is great. So our next question is from Georgian Gardens. What evidence is there of life on Mars?
Oh, that's really interesting. So there isn't really evidence yet of life on Mars, but as I understand it, what there is there are indications of previous existence of water on Mars, and that's what all those Mars missions are looking for. They're looking for evidence of water so that they can understand whether there's a possibility, whether there was life in the past on Mars, or whether there is potentially, the potential for life to exist on Mars in the future. I mean, I have spoken to somebody who is a astrobiologist who was involved in sending the Perseverance rover to Mars, which was all those rovers are up there searching for signs of life. And what she explained to me, which I thought was very interesting, was that if we do find life on Mars, it's most likely to be microbes. So quite invisible things you can only see under a microscope. And it was during COVID that we were having that conversation, and we were thinking, my goodness, there are millions and millions of microbes down here on Earth. But what do we do with the microbes down here on Earth? In the main, we wash our hands a lot. We don't treat them as a special life form. And yet, if we found them on Mars, they would be unbelievably special.
Okay. So the next question. So St. Joseph Catholic Primary School asking, where did you learn about space? Was it in primary school?
You would think that I should have learned more about space because I was born the week that Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman ever to orbit the Earth, went on her very famous mission. And so I grew up with the Apollo space missions and the space shuttle program and all of those things. But I think because I was in primary school in a time when there wasn't a lot going on in space, it seemed like something that was very distant and didn't really have much to do with our everyday lives. So we didn't learn much about it, actually. And I really am sorry because there were so many exciting things happening then. But I think today we've kind of moved to a completely different situation where in primary school, we just use the internet. We just use, satellite navigation to, play games on our devices and things like that. And we don't think about space at all. It's become so everyday. So I wish I had learned more about space when I was at primary school. And I'm really glad that I've had the chance to learn so much more about space now as a grown-up.
Okay, great. So I have a question here from Michael Siddle Primary School. Where do most meteors come from?
Oh, back to the space science questions. I'm just going to have to say again, I don't know. I think you'll have to ask your teacher or your science lead, or have a look on Google and see if you can find out where most of the meteors come from. What I do know is that you can watch meteors coming through the Earth's atmosphere. And there are lots of places you can get that information. But the UK Space Agency, I know every month publishes a blog that says what to look out for this month. So if you live somewhere where you can look up at the night sky, It's really good to know, actually. You need to not have a full moon because the moon can be too bright to see the meteors, but you can look up at the night sky without even a telescope if it's a dark night and a clear sky, and you can see meteors, and you can also see satellites up there. So it's a really interesting thing to just go look and see how close we are actually to all those things happening in space.
Wow. Okay, so that kind of leads us on to Prague British International School are asking, how many satellites are there in space?
Well, so there are about, there are a little over 15,000 that have ever been launched, and about 10,000 or more. I had previous slides, so I shouldn't have to try and remember those numbers. I'm going to read them off. So there's still about 10,550 up there, although this number is probably bigger because I got those numbers from the last report that the European Space Agency did. And I suspect it's more now because we're quite a long way through this year. So let's round it up and say there are about 11,000 satellites up there, and about 8,000 of them are working. And the rest of them are waiting to deorbit, or if they're big ones, they might have kind of gotten stuck in their orbits, and they're waiting for somebody to get their business off the ground to go and move that junk out of the way.
Okay, so Thornhill Primary School, so they're asking, what is the best thing about satellites in your opinion?
Oh, in my opinion, there's no question that the best thing about satellites is that, I should say two things. I'm going to cheat and give you two answers. One is that it really has made the world a closer place, you know, because when I was growing up, places that weren't right where you lived could be a bit of a mystery to you. But now, you know, the world is open to everybody because of the internet, because we can you know, see what's going on in other countries, because we have satellite television, because we have satellite internet, because we have satellite communications. I mean, I lived overseas. I lived in India when I was about 8 years old. And with just the early days of satellites, where I was able to talk to my grandparents in California from India on a satellite connection. And that just took ages, though. It was really, really slow. You know, I would say hello, and then you'd wait and wait and wait, and then they would say hello. But now you can use a satellite connection on with your mobile service or your internet, and you don't even know you're using it. So I think that the way that the satellites have made the world a connected place is really amazing. But the other really important things that satellite has given us is that ability to look at what's going on the Earth and really tell the story about climate change and why we have to stop putting all the plastic in the ocean and killing off this planet. And as I say, you know, this is a really special planet because there's so much life that's supported here, but actually we haven't respected the planet very well. And more than half of the evidence that is being used to monitor, to keep track of the health of the planet, about half of those climate variables, they're called, that are monitored by the United Nations and other organizations to keep track of the health of our planet, you can only see those things or measure those things from space. So satellites have been really, really important in helping us understand climate change and try and fight against it.
They really are, aren't they? So our next question then comes from Thornhill Primary School, and they would like to know, is there internet in space as you're closer to the satellites?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there are companies like SpaceX and another company based in the UK called Mathera, that's another entrepreneur, and they are providing internet connections from space. So now there are kind of primary schools in villages in Africa that were never able to connect to the internet that have a satellite dish on, you know, on top of their school, and now they can connect to the internet through those satellite connections. But there isn't really a need. Well, I should say there's internet connections on the International Space Station and probably on the Chinese space station as well. Those Chinese astronauts are probably able to access the internet up there. I know when Tim Peake was on his mission, he did like a song of the day that he used to put out on Twitter. It was used to be called Twitter then instead of X, where he picked a song every day that he was going to listen to, and he would tweet that out to everybody. And so I know that now the astronauts can use the internet to talk to, have a video call with their families and things like that. But what's going to be really interesting is quite soon the Artemis mission is going to the moon. And the intention is for those astronauts, which will be the first woman to ever go to the moon, the first person of color to ever go to the moon, that crew of astronauts, when they get to the moon, they're going to build a moon base. And the idea is that they will live and work on the moon and not just go and pick up a few rock samples and come back like the Apollo missions did. And they will need internet while they are living and working on the moon. And there are companies in the UK who are going to be building that solution, the satellites that will go around the moon to provide internet access and phone service to people who are living and working on the moon. If you're interested in that, you should just look into Artemis and see, follow that mission, because they're launching very, very soon in the next couple of years.
Fabulous. So we've had quite a few questions from various students asking about astronaut training and whether they use swimming pools to train in.
Yeah, they definitely use swimming pools. It's the closest thing that you can get to the feeling of no gravity, zero gravity. So certainly also for things like doing spacewalks and being able to go outside the International Space Station, they use swimming pools to train for that. Another thing that they use, which is another reason that I would never go, is that they use a thing called a parabolic flight, which is basically an airplane that goes up and then makes this roller coaster flight motion. And when it gets to the top and just starts coming back down, like you feel on the roller coaster where your stomach goes up and, on a really fast ride at the amusement park, you feel that you're weightless for just a second. Well, those airplanes can help astronauts be weightless for a little bit longer than a second. It's not long. It's still only, I think, a matter of seconds. But that helps them train for the feeling of weightlessness and also for how to not have their stomachs be so upset when they are launching up to the International Space Station.
Oh, goodness me. Okay, so we've had so many questions come through. I've got one here from Class 4 Holy Trinity Roman Catholic in Brearfield. Do you think we will ever learn everything there is to know about space, or will there always be something new to learn?
I think that we will never learn everything there is to know about anything. I think that space just still contains so many things that we don't know, that we don't even know that we don't know them. So I don't think we'll ever learn all there is to know. And that's a great thing, because, who wants to know everything about everything? I think life would be very dull if you weren't finding something new to learn every day.
Definitely. Okay. I don't know, this might be one for the Google, but Malden Primary School are asking, how do you know the temperature of a star?
Oh, well, I don't know the specific answer, but I know a bit about that. And it's, one of the ways that you can measure that is from the color of the star. And so if you go and Google it, what you'll see is that astronomers, who are investigating that, they're able to look at the color, which kind of tells them what the gases are, what the composition of the star, what it's made out of. And then that allows them, they can't put a thermometer in, obviously, but it allows them to calculate what they think the temperature would be.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one or two more. So River Primary School would like to know, how will they control the space junk collectors?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, one of the really interesting things is that up until now, satellites, spacecraft were pretty much designed to go to a place and then stay there. And so they're not made to fly around. You know, they have always been designed to just go to a particular orbit and just stay in that orbit, or go to a planet and you know, they can drive around on the planet like the Mars rovers do, or go on a very long journey like one of the big missions where they send probes or something out, and those travel past different planets and they take measurements and send the information back. But they are traveling kind of, you know, in a specific direction. What we've never done before is send spacecraft up that are designed to find other objects and move into positions so that they can connect with that other object. And that object might be spinning out of control, you know, it might be moving around itself. That hasn't been designed, you know, so those companies that I talked about, Astroscale and ClearSpace and those companies, they're doing a lot of development of new technologies, and they're sending demonstration spacecraft up to see, can we maneuver it? Because it's not like there's a driver in the driver's seat. They have to control that by sending commands to the computer on board the spacecraft from the Earth. And so that it will, you know, find the right orbit and it will be able to move up safely close to the object they're trying to get hold of, and then safely move it down so that it can burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. So it's remote control, but, you know, with a level of precision that we've not seen down here on Earth yet, and definitely have not seen up in space, which is, you know, why it's so interesting what they're doing.
Okay, so I think we can just finish on this one final question, as we are running out of time, sadly, even though we've got loads of questions through, which is brilliant, loads of enthusiasm. So River Primary are asking, what was the name of the first rocket which travelled to space?
Oh, the very first rocket. I don't know the name of the first rocket. I know the ones from the Apollo program were called the Saturn V rockets. Those are the ones that actually made it to the moon. There were Gemini rockets before that in the US. There was a rocket, I'm trying to remember the name of the rocket, called, I want to say, Black Arrow, which was the only successful rocket that the UK ever built, that British rocket scientists built. It didn't launch from Britain. It launched in the 1970s. It launched from Australia, and it put a satellite up called Prospero. And then we didn't have any more British-built rockets. But probably the very first successful rocket was probably launched by Russia, and I don't know what the name of that rocket would have been. And that's probably another one for Wikipedia or Google. So
a Russian rocket, then
probably, if I'm guessing, yeah, because they were a little bit ahead in the race to put things into space before the Americans caught up.
Okay, so I want to say thank you ever so much for answering all those questions, Katherine, and that wonderful talk that you've given us today. And thank you to all the schools and students and teachers watching and putting questions into the chat. It's so lovely to see so much enthusiasm out there for space. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Lisa, who's just going to finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you very much, Katherine. Well, the good old Google, I had a little Google whilst you were both speaking, and I did find something called a German V2 rocket, which went up in June 1944.
Oh,
who knows?
So way before.
Who knows? Who knows? And so thank you, Katherine, for an informative and interesting talk. As you say, we could talk about it all day long, but we got there in the end, so thank you very much. And I am sure our audience will be inspired to learn more about careers within the space industry. So thank you again to everyone who joined us today. Enjoy the rest of World Space Week, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.